This is Loudest Crow. I am Jonathan Louderback.
I'm Justin Kroh, and we're here to caw through the noise.
Yes, we're talking about YouTube. I know we're just going to get right into it, but I think that YouTube is really interesting in just like the creator space on all of the internet in general. Because a lot of people get into it nowadays with the notion, like, a lot of people start doing it, and like, I want to do this as my job.
Yeah.
Right? Or a lot of the OGs couldn't have known because there was no precedent that they would be able to live off that. You know, they're just kind of doing what they fucking wanted to do. You know,
Yeah.
making fun content or whatever it might be.
Well, the sad thing is like, the site itself has started bending itself in that direction where it's like, yes, look at all these tools you can use to grow your audience and market to people and get advertisements and sponsorship deals.
Bad. It's like not inherently bad, but I do think it has, because I think that sort of stuff is still useful for, because I think there are people who can do both, where they want to be legitimate creators and grow an audience and make money off of it. But I think that type of methodology seeps into, like, not necessarily those type of creators, but more like sort of like the opportunists. You know, the people who hop on YouTube Shorts and repost content.
Yeah, well, and like,
and stuff like that.
It just changes the culture of the site more than you might expect, just because, yes, there are still plenty of people on the platform. In fact, I'd argue most people on the platform are genuine creators who just want to make cool stuff and share it with the world. But it's just, I see more and more people just on the site reposting things, remaking what other people have done, reusing old ideas, just trying to get money and get views. And it's kind of sad, especially when you see a creator who like slowly transitions from doing their own thing to just kind of copying everyone else.
Yeah, I had I like to watch map game YouTubers, just because they know that's kind of like my space. It's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to have other people I know who do that sort of stuff. And one of them, and maybe it's just what they wanted to do, so good for them, became a VTuber. Like a VTuber playing a map game playing VTuber, which is just like, okay, I can't help but wonder how much of that change was motivated by the success of VTubers in the space, out of a more commercial interest than out of like, and I think it's about this conversation is like, people can do whatever they want, and I cannot disparage somebody for wanting to take this and make it commercially viable, because I understand how much more pleasurable a career like that would be.
Oh, of course.
Over a generic 9-to-5.
No, getting money from something that you're passionate about is awesome, I think. But I think another thing that happens with YouTube is when it becomes such a money game, is that it kind of ruins that passion and just dilutes it significantly.
But I think that's always been the case ever since people have been able to make money off of it. I think you're right. Like, the tools available do. I think what the tools do is they push new people into doing that earlier and sooner. Because, like, if you're a young channel, like, there's not really a lot of reason to care only about the money, because you don't make any fucking money anyway.
Yeah.
Right? You got to focus first and foremost on finding a niche and either really developing something that you enjoy to do, or really hyper-tailoring it to be commercially successful. The second one is so much more difficult, that I think most people who get it big nowadays are the people who do the first, where they just are doing something they're really passionate about, or they repost content.
Or they repost it. That's something that bothers me too. Like, I'll see on YouTube, I'll see like the same video with like a different title,
or like a different like secondary video beneath it. Like a different Minecraft parkour. Or
no,
whatever.
Not even that. It's like the exact same video that's like 10 seconds long, reposted 500 different times, and the algorithm will keep feeding me like different iterations of that same video.
Dude, I'm usually better about it. I have to constantly tell myself I'm on YouTube Shorts or whatever it is, and I'm like, okay, get off of it. You don't want to do that right now. But whenever I'm tired, I hate it, dude. I'll be going to bed and I'm like, okay, let me just check all my notifications, go through my phone as I'm laying down, and I'll get on YouTube Shorts and it'll be like 30 minutes and I'm like, what the fuck am I doing? I'm trying to go to bed.
I do not dabble with YouTube Shorts. Like, I will straight up,
it's very wise,
intentionally just seek like short videos as opposed to like actual YouTube Shorts.
There's a lot of cool stuff on there. I've seen some pretty cool original creators in the YouTube Short space. Like, there's one I found recently, like live at, like, I think it's like basically it makes comedic little animated bits for animals, and it'll do tidbits of facts about those animals and like put it into a societal context. It's like apparently skunks will do handstands.
We live in a society
Pretty much.
do handstands.
Or it's like otters are the only ones that know how to use tools, and I'll make little shorts about that. That's fun. But for every one of those, there's 10 reposts. There's 10, whatever. It's not, because what you could argue that 10-minute YouTube videos is too short of content and fucks with your attention span.
You could.
Right? I've heard people argue about that in the past.
Yeah.
And now we're at a point where we're not even watching 10 minutes, 5 minutes. We're watching 30 fucking second videos for 30 minutes.
And now it's become 30-second videos with like a second video of like a mobile game playing below it. And it's like it's getting worse and worse. Well, like that stuff, what's weird is I've noticed that I keep finding myself watching longer and longer videos on YouTube. So somehow I'm avoiding the attention span shrinkage.
I think there's something to be said that, so, and this is going to sound a little tinfoil hat, but just bear with me. So in general, as society advances, the average IQ, it goes up, right? And we become, people who are born into a generation of technology are more acclimated to using that technology. You could argue that in a digital age, having like a quick mind is valuable, being able to quickly parse out the loads of fucking information that are thrown your way, right? I have found that I am able to answer questions on Google or research problems or troubleshoot way faster than any of my parents are, right? Because I know how to do it. I'm like, I know how to like immediately, that article is useless, right? That video is useless. Here's the video we need, sort of deal. And you do that by scrolling and looking and parsing out information really quick. Now, there is a dangerous side to that because, of course, sometimes you need to watch longer form or read longer form, and you can't if you're so used to it, or it's hard if you're so used to it. But it is still, I'd like to argue, a skill, being able to quickly parse out this information. But I think that, like, while it is useful in the digital space and sometimes in troubleshooting in the real space, in the majority of the real space, it is not useful. Right.
Well, I mean, and I wouldn't even call it a skill so much as it is a habit almost.
Not even a habit, because it's a mindset. It's like a different type of mindset for consuming information.
Mindset's good, yeah.
Than previous generations.
You're kind of setting yourself onto a certain like mental track. And I think what's valuable is when you have that capacity and you develop it a little bit, but you don't like derail yourself going down that track.
For sure.
Instead, you have this ability to switch to like, okay, I need to be in quick brain mode.
I'm certainly not arguing that YouTube Shorts are the reason that we have that skill. Like they're not, or TikTok or whatever it is. But I think it is a symptom of the fact that our generation does. Because like, why is our attention span shorter, and why is attention span shrunk since the times before? Even like our parents' generation has a shorter attention span than their parents, so on and so forth, even if it's by a little bit. It is because we have access to more information than we ever did before, right? It's like if you're talking about the Middle Ages in Europe, your average person would never see a library, much less a fucking book, right? So it's, why would you need to have the ability to parse through many books very quick, or just be able to skim and find the information? You don't need that. So of course your attention span is going to be longer because you're basically dragging the same piece of information out over a longer period of time. Now this is all anecdotal. I don't have any study basis for this. This is just like my thought process. Whereas nowadays, even your average person has access to more information in their pocket than any human being has for like the entirety of our history.
Yeah.
Right? Which is crazy. Yeah. And requires an entirely different mindset to be able to not go insane.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Necronomicon. If you open its books, you're like,
Well, and speaking of YouTube, just like, there's this one site that I learned about like 5-6 years ago called PetiteTube. I don't know if it's still up, but it will just show you a random YouTube video that has not been viewed yet.
Interesting.
And just like going through that is so fascinating because you'll just see all these random things. And it's like, there's so many little corners of the world out there, and there's so many people living in those corners doing things that I never would even think about doing. Like there might be a video of just like a goldfish swimming around and then someone like feeding it like little Oreo crumbs or something, right? And like you have all these like, it's just, wait, really quick, it's just like amazing how many like combinations of things you can do that are out there. And as massive and just breathtaking as our collection of like recorded stuff is, there's like so many more times. There's so much more that's not recorded.
No, for sure. Yeah. And even in that recorded space, there's still so much you will never see because of a language barrier, right? Like America is, of the nations of the world, one of the more populous ones, and the speaking, the Anglo world, you know, is even larger if you include places like Australia, England, New Zealand, Canada. But if like that's where our internet stops, at the Anglo-speaking world, and even then, you know, being the second most spoken language, you do see have foreigners speaking English and posting videos in English. But then outside of that, there's a Japanese internet, there's an Indian internet, there is a French, a German internet that you simply don't see because you wouldn't be able to fucking comprehend it outside of a few videos, right? So there is, to put it lightly, a metric fuck ton more content than we will ever be able to comprehend or see. Which is, it's like, there's so much out there.
There's so much out there.
It's like, I like how you phrase it as little corners of the world, because there's this tiny little corners of the world. It's like, that's why I think travel is so valuable, not because, even if you don't get to do it often or for that long, like, you don't need to go out there for years at a time, but being able to see that there is an entire world outside, because most people die within 25 miles of where they're born, like the large majority of human beings, which is not inherently bad, but it's a sign that they never get out. Right? Like, most Springfieldians may go on a trip. They may go on a trip to one of the coasts or something like that. But most of them stay in the Midwest their entire lives.
Yeah.
Which is very bad for your ability to, like, comprehend, like, how big, you know what I mean? It's this perspective thing.
I sort of get what you're saying. Like, I think it was both my parents, or maybe only one. Actually, I think it was mainly my dad. My dad, like, went to Belgium on a missions trip for a couple of years with his church. And I think that's really all you need. Or, like if you're a student, maybe a little bit of foreign exchange stuff, or just to study abroad, or even just taking, like, a 1 or 2 month vacation to another country and just kind of giving yourself enough time to immerse yourself in the culture. Give yourself enough time to have days where, like, you aren't doing a touristy thing, and you're just kind of there, right? I think that's all you really need. So I don't think there's like, oh, like you said, it's not inherently bad for people to die close to where they live. I don't think it's bad to, like, you know, kind of have your space and to stay there, because that's where you're comfortable.
Yeah.
But pushing those limits every now and then is definitely
I think
valuable.
It's less like once in a lifetime and more like you should do it every so often. Like maybe a longer trip or just a trip in general to a different country, a different culture. Because I think it is easy. It is not like a permanent enlightenment you reach whenever you go someplace else. It's like if you go back to your home place and get immersed in the problems there, you'll slowly, you know, just naturally become less worldly. It's almost like a bar you have to maintain, I think. And it's not like it's necessary to maintain it, but I do think that it informs so much of your decision making. Because, like, here's what I'm saying: it's very easy to dehumanize people not out of malice, but out of the sheer incomprehensibility.
Lack of understanding, yeah.
It's not even lack of understanding, it's incomprehensibility. It's like, picture an apple in your head. Now picture 2 apples in your head.
Okay.
Now picture 8 billion apples in your head.
Okay.
But outside of the joke, it is literally, you can picture maybe the number 8 billion, but, like, you physically can't conjure that large of a number. Even 1,000 is outside of comprehension. Right?
For me.
Humans, I believe, are only capable of forming and maintaining, like, 170 relationships before, like, you start to lose stuff in the cracks.
I forgot who. Yeah, there's, like, some social psychologists who talked about that.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are people who can do more, or some people who can only do less. But I think it's probably true, like, to be able to have, like, full dossiers, full comprehension of those. You know what I mean? You can have plenty of acquaintances, but, like, of those people that you genuinely know. So, like, it's normal that you would not think about the people of the population of Japan, or the population of Indonesia, or Laos, or Rwanda. You know, it's very normal, but it does, like, especially in America, like, you could argue whether or not we need to be doing what we're doing, but seeing as we have military bases in, like, fucking everywhere, and we have people who, you know, go and die for those countries and for those people, knowing who those people are, you know, and being able to make decisions based off that, I think is important. Yeah. Especially as a voter. You know, maybe I'm a bit of a cynic optimist.
A cynic optimist.
I am. You know, I'm like, things can work out, but people suck ass.
Well, I don't know. Actually, it reminds me. Have you seen Guardians of the Galaxy 3 yet?
I have not. I'm going to be seeing the Mario movie next Wednesday, though.
Oh, that's hype. That's real hype.
I've heard good things about the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, though.
It is great. Have you seen the first 2?
I've seen the first 2.
Okay, yeah, it's great. You'll love it. And not to, like, go into spoiler territory, but there was just one guy who at one point was talking about, like, oh, there's, like, a, you know, society that gets to this point where it's like, yeah, they're advanced and intelligent, but we still need to weed out the ignorance and the bigotry and stuff. And I saw that and I was like, what is ignorance? Like, where does ignorance and bigotry come from? Because like, say you're just like in your own little world, right? And you're fine. You stay there your whole life. You never encounter like another culture, and you die. And you're fine. I wouldn't call that person bigoted, but like throw them into a new environment.
But they have the ammunition to be bigoted because of ignorance.
Well, I don't know. Do they though? Like,
Yes.
well, they have the ammunition, so they wouldn't necessarily be like super bigoted. They may be like kind of confused about new cultures and be like, what?
I think that it's so. I think in this once again, this is not like this is totally opinionated and not based on any sort of study or anything. I think the root of most prejudice and discrimination is a lack of understanding and fear. Fear primarily.
Oh yeah, fear.
And you fear the things naturally that you don't understand, you don't know, right? It's like, I think that in this country, like, the reason people fear black people mostly in the Midwest and most in the rural areas where you have still like that legacy racism, maybe that's not like existing, that like racism that exists more in the sense of a lack of understanding than in a genuine like cultivated prejudice. I think it's one of those things where, say you live in like rural Ohio, no, not Ohio, that's a pretty populated state, Montana, right? Just rural Montana, and you hear about the gun violence in Chicago, and you're like, oh, well, my town is all white. Every single person I've ever known my entire life is white. And I hear about the gun violence from Fox News in Chicago perpetrated by black people. Huh.
Well, and what's really unfortunate is so much of that just like goes back to redlining.
Oh,
and
yeah.
how there's this historical root that's just like stuck. And we see more and more black people starting like to climb out of that finally. But it's still like a really long process that has a long way to go.
What's really difficult, right, is I've often had to argue people who bring up the statistics like, well, only 13% of the population, but they commit 50% of the crime. But the truth is, it's like whenever you say that, you're kind of signaling yourself as kind of a racist. You know what I mean? Because there's one truth I think is true. Your skin color and your race doesn't fucking really inform anything, right? It's your culture, it's your socioeconomic status, it's your upbringing. Yeah. Right? Those are the three most important things. There certainly is an effective nature on your personality, but that's probably more due to your parents' genetics and just the circumstances of your birth than anything else. Not like your race or ethnicity. And the fact is that black people in this country have been kept in a place of not being able to develop themselves financially, and they had such a fucking deep chasm to build themselves out of, right? Like, right after slavery, you know what happened? They stayed on the plantations and got paid not living wages to farm the same shit that they were farming beforehand, because
they had nowhere to go.
There was no program. It's like you can't tell somebody. It's like one of those things we're talking about. It's like we're so lucky in the sense that we know the general shape of the world. We know the general shape of our country, of our area.
Yeah, it's flat.
You're right. But we know that general shape. For most of human history, people like peasants and other people who were, abused by landowners, like they were kept ignorant of that. Like over yonder hill was what they knew. That was the scope of their understanding of the world, right? Like they couldn't draw a rough map of like the world like we can, just because we know things. Like they don't know where they can go. They don't know what opportunity is, and they had to build themselves out of that chasm. And we're dealing with the legacy of that today, still, right? Like that's where the conversation of reparations come from. That's where the conversation of what is it called? The college thing, where
affirmative action.
Affirmative action. That's where that comes from. It's like I get a little frustrated whenever white people are like, well, I don't get why we are being treated unequally. It's because I guess it's a conversation of should unequal treatment or preferential treatment be given now to rectify the unequal treatment that was given then.
Yeah, that's a big burning question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm honestly mixed. I will be honest. I lean more towards no. It's like two wrongs don't make a right. Right. Too imbalanced. This isn't the kind of thing where it's balanced out by more imbalance. It's the kind of thing that unfortunately needs to be given time to heal as a scar. And we should definitely feel compassion for the people who are like by nothing of their doing, they are just in a worse. They came from a worse upbringing, so they have to try a little bit harder. And I think we should try and encourage them and give them access to resources that they can use. But we also shouldn't like fork them money or fork them more opportunities than we would someone of like the same race.
You know,
I
think
race.
opportunities we should, yeah, but I don't necessarily support like direct monetary reparations. You know, because I don't think because teach a man to fish, you know, he'll live for his whole life, right?
Yeah.
But you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. And that's kind of the same thing. It's like, I think that affirmative action has had a lot of really good benefits for black communities and such. You could argue that there were white people who are more deserving, per se, but think about this. This is something I learned recently just from a clip on YouTube. So once again, this is just anecdotal, but it's like Jon Stewart talking about the TV industry. It was like, why was the TV industry all white? Right? It was because unpaid internships in big cities where the TV shows were filmed, right? That's how you got unpaid interns out of college, and then you hired your permanent staff from those unpaid interns. But who could afford to send their kids to live in the big city without them being paid?
White
Rich people.
Yeah.
And who was rich? White people, because of the legacy of how wealth is distributed in this country. It's one of those things where if you say, well, we'll let this fix on its own, you're allowing the unequal distribution of wealth that is already in the hands of, because wealth propagates wealth. That's just a fact, right? Like, in very rare circumstances do people drop from that higher rung to a lower economic status, right? Very rarely. Now, people in the middle class can drop pretty easily, but people in that upper crust or even upper middle class, they have the squish, the liquid, that unless there's somebody
the squish.
Well, like, that's what, that's what it is. It's like they have that maneuverability. Like,
it's a fun word.
Like, they could lose money in the stock market and not lose their home, compared to somebody in the lower middle class or even lower class who's paying rent, right? What I'm saying is, it's like, I think things like affirmative action are valuable because they give people opportunity and allow them to build themselves without really... It's like with Harvard entrances or like MIT entrances. It's one of those things where, yeah, they only have so many students. They have 1,300 students, and they have 10,000 qualified applicants, right? People who meet every metric of what they need to get into the school. You experience this. So it's how do they fucking differentiate it?
Yeah.
Race is pretty unfair. It is. But what isn't fair, I think, or is one of the better ways to differentiate, is socioeconomic status. It's like, I would rather a kid get in there with a full ride who needs it and who could build up his family and his community than somebody who doesn't necessarily need it as much, who will go just as far without an MIT education. You kind of get what I mean?
I get what you mean. One thing that, and I watched a couple videos about this myself because I was curious what people were saying about it. One point I saw against affirmative action was oftentimes... Now, with schools that have a ton of applicants, like really good schools, they don't have to worry about this so much. But for like kind of middle of the road schools that are good but not great, oftentimes if they don't have a lot of black applicants, but they still want to have like a quota of black students, and a lot of these institutions do. A lot of people in my family either work for colleges or worked for colleges in the past. Oftentimes, to meet that quota, they have to start accepting applicants that are underqualified, and that ultimately harms them.
That's
unfortunately.
True. That is true.
And so it depends on the institution. Like MIT this year, or not this year, last year now. Wow, it's been over a year. But when I was applying to them and such, normally they say they have about like 11,000, 12,000 qualified applicants, and they have to somehow narrow it down to 1,500. Last year they had 33,000.
Oh my god!
And I think it was because they're coming out of they're coming out of the pandemic, so
but
we had a lot
of
people.
inflation.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Great inflation because of the pandemic. Like a lot of teachers are like, have an A, why not, right? And
then test optional
yeah,
stuff, just in general.
And so it's easier to have qualified applicants that way. And like my grades and test scores and all that were still really impressive. I didn't get in. That was sad. And I talked to a few people about this. I won't name them, but like a lot of them are like, okay, I don't believe affirmative action is all that bad, but I'm mad that you didn't get in, and it's probably because of affirmative action. And I'm like, well,
probably, like, maybe not though.
Well, that's exactly like I don't. I'll get this out of the way. I don't care anymore. Like, I've really enjoyed my time at Drury. I'm glad I'm there. I have a lot of friends. I'm glad I stayed in Springfield. I love my parents, so I'm glad I got to stay with them for a few more years. Like, I'm really glad at how everything turned out. And so I don't really care, like, why I didn't get into those schools. I am sad that I didn't get into any of those, like, big four ones I applied to, though. Because I'm like, with my credentials, I didn't get into any of those.
That's a conversation about our schooling system and about our testing system. You know, it's one of the shittiest thing in this country is just the form and way we teach the standardized testing. And it's the way the colleges push kids into college because they make so much money.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, and what I really hate, I've seen more and more videos about this, is College Board, dude. I've seen more and more videos about that, and just like how bad of a company they are, and they're practically like money laundering.
They're literally money laundering people, dude. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. Like it is an unsupervised body, you know, that can reuse tests. Basically, they decide the metric by, because I've heard before that from like ACT and SAT that your score can jump like 10 percentage points in percentile or whatever based on the test you get randomly assigned to you. You know what I mean? Just because it's not standardized. Like, that's like the one claim to fame. You know, it's like that they are a standardized test that students can take that will whatever, but it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not a big fan of that because, like, I get how it's like, oh, it's a college readiness exam, but I'm like, there's so much more to college readiness and filling in bubbles and stuff. Like, that's why I think, like, for example, it's a great thing that colleges require, like, you know, essays and stuff. I think that's good. But I think, like, you know, especially the bigger colleges, they should all also require interviews, right? Because even if you're writing something...
That's a matter of resources, though.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, like, I got an interview with MIT. Because what they do is that they use a lot of their successful alumni. They'll give the interviews and they'll report back to MIT, which still isn't a watertight system. Like, that's what happened with me. I was hooked up with this doctor who works at Barnes Jewish in St. Louis. He was a really cool guy, and I loved talking to him. He loved talking to me. We had a great time. And that's why I was, like, so sure I was going to get into MIT, because I totally rocked that interview. And then when I did get in, I was
of
like...
30,000 students, 10,000 knocked out their interview.
Yeah, right.
For 1,500, you know, it's just a matter of numbers. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
I guess it's also a question of what are we designing the system to do, right? If the system is designed to push the top achieving students to the very tippy top, then it's failing. If the goal of the system is to give the most equitable, affordable education to as many people as possible, it's failing. You know? Our system's not fucking doing anything right. You know?
Someone I was talking to, I'll say it was Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob and one of his friends and I were having a short conversation about, like, equity and equitability and whatever versus equality and whatnot. And everyone, like, references that image of, like, the people looking over a fence at a baseball game and, like, if you give everyone, like, a crate to stand on, the little tallest person doesn't need it, and the shortest person needs 2 crates, and so it's like, really, it's not good because, you know, they all can't see the game. But if we give the short person, like, 2 crates and the tall person 0 crates, and then, like, the medium person 1 crate, well, then everyone gets to see the game and we're all happy. And I see that image and I'm like, okay, like, in this very specific situation, yes, that makes sense. Right? Why would you rob a short friend from getting to see a baseball game? That's stupid. But, like, when it comes to, like, legislating equity, it becomes really murky and really dangerous, I would say. Like a slippery slope sort of deal where it's like, you know, the more you're trying, because what you have to do if you're trying to make something equitable is you have to say, okay, what's the standard that everyone should be able to reach? Who gets to decide that standard? And then, like, you know, what resources can we allocate to make sure everyone's reaching that standard? Because you also have to factor in, like, you know, how do we differentiate between, oh, this person is in their socioeconomic status by choice, and this person is not. Differentiating that with legislation seems really hard and tricky.
I think there's 2 things to take in consideration. First is that people may think they're choosing, but are merely victims of circumstance. You can't have made a choice that you don't know you could have made. For example, I would say I enjoy philosophy, and I enjoy discussing, and I enjoy these grand ethical discussions about what's right. I enjoy talking to my friends about their feelings. Why do I enjoy doing those things? Because I got to talk to my Grandma Lou. If I didn't have my Grandma Lou in my life, I wouldn't be this way. Is that a choice? It's not. Not really.
Well, it's not. Well,
it's my choice to go there. I could have not. I have plenty of people in my family who don't. But then it's a question of what is the role of government and the lives of people, and that's a political theory question.
Well, before we go there, I would argue that, well, perhaps you're having the opportunity to talk to your Grandma Lou was not a choice, but it could have been a choice to enjoy those discussions and to want to pursue more of those discussions. Well, now we're getting into like a free will debate.
Oh
so
yeah, very much so.
But
well, it's everything always goes to free will. Pretty much.
That's true. Yeah.
But no, you go ahead. I think you were about to make a point.
Well, all I was going to say is like, I don't know. I feel like, well, even differentiating between equality and equity is a bit hairy in some aspects, because sometimes they're one and the same, sometimes they're not. Honestly, like, I love the simple phrase of equal opportunity, not equal outcome. Like, make sure people get the chances that, well, don't necessarily make sure that everyone gets the same chances, like, obviously. And that's the big thing about the equity debate, I guess, or the equity conversation, I should say. So, when people are coming from different places, like, they're going to, just by nature of their upbringing, have different choices, like you mentioned.
Even in the same socioeconomic status.
Yeah. And so it's like, you have to be a little bit careful there, but that's another reason why, trying to define equity is just so murky and weird. It's like, well, like, how do we equate, say, someone who was brought up in a family of mechanics with someone who was brought up with a family of farmers with someone who was brought up with a family of, like... Yeah.
I think it's like, the root of these discussions is nested in a lot of assumptions that we hold about life. And I think where you in this country, for example, about this conversation, I think you do see a very clear divide between red and blue. And if you look at like the basic ideology of these people, it's like, what's really interesting is that people on the conservative end of the spectrum who don't necessarily believe in more equity-based solutions, they don't believe in welfare payments and stuff like that. Like, what are their base assumptions? Their base assumptions are they come from an evangelical Protestant base. All humans are sinners, right? They're always doing their worst. And you have to find faith. You have to find your place in God to forgive you for those things, right? To guide you to being a better person, effectively, right? And what's interesting about that is, oddly enough, not because of course not all Christians are that way, but there is this big evangelical base in this country that is that way, right? That believes that humans are born sinners. I would argue that on the left there is, of course there are cynical aspects, but I think in general there's more of a base assumption that people are trying their best to better their lives, right? And you want to give them the resources to do that, whereas people think, like, what was the conversation? It's like, oh, well, if you give people welfare and you give them disability, then they're just not going to work because they're lazy, right? Like, there's that base assumption, there's that base conversation, and you can't really have a conversation about how they're not lazy because you're not tackling you're not arguing with their actual conclusions, you're arguing with their ideological basis, which is something much harder to unravel and persuade somebody about. It's like we were just talking about, like, our conversation about whether or not, like, this equity sort of base solution matters goes to free will. Yeah. Whether or not somebody chose to be where they're at, which is like a whole different deep conversation to have. I think it's really fascinating how nested these issues are in each other and how they always come back to like some core underpinning.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, there's just like this
idea.
There's a fundamental difference in worldview that it's not very easy to change, when it does come to equitable, like, if I were just like to lay out my platform, like if I was a politician running for president or whatever, if I were to be like, this is what I think we should do, and feel free to critique it, I would say, I want a better social safety net. I think that you should be able to live off Social Security, right? I don't think you should, once you get up there in age, I think that Social Security should effectively be a okay standard of living. It should pay for a retirement home, is what it should do, right? That way we don't have old people in the streets begging for money. Right. Like, the whole point of Social Security in the first place was to make sure that whenever you got up there in age, you weren't poor. But right now, you can't live off of it. So we need a better social safety net. I think that we need to have, honestly, free education would be an end goal for me. Free higher education. Because I think that would do a couple things. I think that more people pursuing a higher education and then dropping out if it's not for them because they're not wasting money, good. The people who need to get it can. And you can maybe even have a hybrid system where, like, I'm going to community college. It's free. It's not the highest quality. It's not like upper crust prestige. I don't care. That's what I need, right? You can even just have public universities be free and keep the private universities if you want. Right?
I can sort of track with you there. The one thing that's making me say kind of no in my mind is you have so many, well, nowadays especially, you have so many paid internships and apprenticeships and trade schools and stuff like that, where it's like, depending on what you're wanting to do. And another thing is like, I've noticed this especially in the computer science industry, people are caring less and less about, college degrees, because the value of a college degree is just diminishing rapidly. Because like what we were talking about earlier, like, information is more accessible than ever, and information oftentimes includes education. And, as long as you have the discipline to self-educate and you can prove that you have the skills that you need to have, it's like you oftentimes don't need a college degree depending on what you're going into. Like, if you're going to English or history, I'd rather you have, a college degree. Or like physics, or especially like medicine. Anything anything there. But, like, if you're doing something that's, again, more of a trade, like programming is a trade, I would say, or, a carpenter or a mechanic or something like that.
Well, actual skills that you could prove.
Hard skills or soft skills, yeah. And so it really just, as time goes on, there are more and more options becoming available. So I don't know if there's necessarily a need to make public education free. I think definitely having more 2-year programs available to people for free would be great. And I think there's kind of a fetishization of a 4-year college experience in America, and I think at least as someone who spends a lot of time on the more conservative side of YouTube and of the internet in general, because I usually use my friends for my left point of view, and then I use the internet for my right point of view. I've seen a lot of people starting to just push back against education, in general, just saying, it's getting so expensive, and nowadays you don't really need it nearly as much, because, way back in the day, you had 5% of job applicants had a college degree. Now I think it's up to 40% or 60%, something like that. It's crazy.
Originally, you had to have a high school degree to get a job. Then it moved up to bachelor's, and now, if in the professional world, I would argue we're kind of getting to a place where you need a master's to get one of those upper crust professional jobs.
Depends on where you are. Well,
it depends on where you are, but I think that's the door opener for kind of like upper crust corporate America. You know what I mean?
I get what you're saying. Yeah,
it's you don't need it, but I think it is one of those things that it's because how many people have masters? It's probably once again back to 7% that the old bachelors used to be, and the doctorate even smaller. Because I do agree with you. I think education is quickly becoming obsolete as it stands, but I do still think, because if you look at the numbers and you look at the outcome of people's lives based on what education they receive, and people who get a bachelor's degree out-earn people who get a high school diploma by, I think, 1 million in their lifetime. Not nothing. They usually have a higher quality of life in terms of interpersonal relationships, in terms of substance abuse and things like that. Right. It's now you could definitely argue, and I would say you were right, that if you make it open to everybody, then those numbers are going to change.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you make it open to everybody, it's going to become, in a way, the new high school degree. But I think there's 2 things you need to change. You need to make it free, and then at the same time, the government couldn't attack this, but you need to attack the culture of, because here's the problem right now. I think in our system, it's there's a cultural expectation out of high school, if you're a decent high school student, to go to college, and colleges know this. And they charge you out the ass.
Capitalize on it, yeah.
They charge you out the ass because they know the government's going to pay for you at the bare minimum if you're poor. And they know other than that, people who are in the middle, who don't get that much government assistance, are going to pay for it out their own ass because they think it's valuable. Right? And it's a really, really... It's the system, The thing I think that is inherently wrong about conservatism is I can spend all day, every day, arguing about why we shouldn't do shit. Right? And give you a number of reasons why a number of solutions are going to fail or not work. But the status quo is not working, right? And what is the conservative solution to the educational system, right? In public schools, what is their solution? Fucking private schools. That's stupid. That it really is, because private schools are not accountable to national curriculum guidelines. They can teach whatever the fuck they want. Maybe at first, as the public system would die, they'd be about the same price, because that's kind of their selling point. They're it would just cost you the same. It wouldn't be in the long run. If you look at countries like Japan and England, who have mostly private educational systems, people who go to the public system fail, and people who go to private systems have to pay out the ass to get their kids a decent education. So it's not equitable in a good way. And it's who's making the money, right? Our public education system is a public service. The teachers are making the money, the administrators are making the money, and the public is benefiting. Why do conservatives push so hard for private education? It's because they know people who would make money off of these schools, right?
Well, I think, first of all, yes, a lot of conservatives push for private school, and I will concede that conservatives are really bad with education. They're good with other things, especially economics, but not with education. And one thing I'll see a lot of them talking about is we'll just do homeschooling instead. That way you don't have to pay private schools. You don't have to worry about that. But then that leads to, like a very directed education, which can oftentimes breed ignorance and bigotry, as we were kind of talking about earlier. Or like it leads to the child growing up in a very isolated, not necessarily an echo chamber, because their parents, if their parents are good parents, they're not going to berate them with like political ideology. They're going to actually try to give them a good education. But then the parents are limited. I think one of the biggest advantages of the public education system, at least as it stands for us here in America, is having different teachers for different subjects, right? Because not only do they get to focus on those, unless it's like, the football coach who was given a couple history classes, but we won't talk about that. Not only do they get to focus on those areas of study, but you just have different perspectives, different voices telling you these different things, and that I think definitely helps with avoiding not even necessarily like avoiding a lack of diversity of thought, but just having different people to help you and raise you up. I think is good. A lot of conservatives will talk about, it's like, oh, I don't want teachers telling my kids what to think or to believe or whatever. And it's like, well, a good teacher isn't doing that. A good teacher is teaching them how to think, not what to think, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, here are the facts, and here's how you can form an opinion based on those facts. But I'm not going to give you the opinion that you're supposed to have with the facts. And that actually leads me to something I was going to talk about. And I don't even know what my stance is on this question, because I've gone back and forth on it a lot. And so I just kind of want to talk about it in general. But is there inherent value in diversity? Because on the one hand, like, I get it, like, like understanding people I think is important, being empathetic, being able to sympathize, civility is made much easier with like an understanding of diversity. But at the same time, if you have a lot of people with different religions, different beliefs, different viewpoints, these differences between people can sometimes, all through history, they lead to huge conflict as well.
Let me answer your question with a question. Why did the United States beat the Soviet Union in the Cold War?
I do not know. Why did the United States beat the Soviet Union?
The Soviet Union's governmental system was exclusionary. It was based on Lenin's belief that the proletariat was not educated or enlightened enough to manage itself. The enlightened few were to guide the masses, the labor, into where they needed to be. He died, and this became a dictatorship, an even more exclusionary policy, where the market of ideas was isolated to those that were approved already by the people on top. Whenever you have, essentially what the Soviet government had was low participation by the masses. Not in the terms of even voting, but low participation in terms of what ideas were allowed, what ideas could be pursued. And they had more unity of thought and more ability to maybe respond to crises, like in the Second World War, and a higher capability of being able to commission great projects because they had to be able to direct all the resources to one thing. But basically, they had less pathways that they could push their resources through because less people were able to make decisions. In America, one of the greatest things about America is that if you're passionate about something and you want to affect that space, you don't have to just vote for a politician. You can get involved in the park service. You can get involved in the school board, the forestry agencies. You can get involved in the border patrol and whatever it is. Work your way up to management and in fact change. What America can do is make meaningful decisions on many levels all at once, because they have many people who are being enabled into affecting the things they're interested in. This freedom sometimes does lead to bad outcomes, where isolated individuals with too much power in isolated places are able to affect great change for negative purposes, right? But oftentimes what it does is it means, like in the context of the Second World War, you have basically the West Coast focusing on the Pacific War and the East Coast focusing on the war in Europe, and you're able to do that because there is such a diversity in the number of people involved in the government. We're going to give you another answer, another kind of story to answer your question. Diversity is not just diversity in skin color or in race.
Diversity of thought.
So diversity, as it stands with a true definition of the word, I think, does have inherent value. For example, one I think the best managerial schemes you can have, and one I think the United States does have, and good times anyway, is the executive does not make the decisions. For example, think about your fast food days. Right now, you may have been different because you were highly competent at what you were doing, but in general, but in fast food in general, the way that they're designed is if there's a problem, you don't get to solve it. You go up to your manager and they solve the problem. Right? What if there's multiple problems all at once? Then you have a backlog as the decision maker is making the decisions. What America can do, because of its diversity, is hand out the decision-making process for problems to the people who actually deal with the problems, which usually does two things. Lowers the burden on the executive, for one, gives independence to the decision makers on the bottom, and two, gives people who are on the ground the ability to actually affect positive change. People who understand, because of their worldview, because of their circumstances, the ability to affect that change. People often disparage America because it's like, oh, another old white man in power. Why do they say that? It's because we expect our government to be able to make solutions for the problems that may, say, the black community faces, the Muslim community faces, or the Jewish community faces, with no actual on-the-ground understanding of what those problems are like, right? Now, the answer isn't going to come purely from them, because there has to be a compromise in our system, but they certainly should have a say. My final example, the Berlin Conference. You know what that is? Do you know what the Scramble for Africa is? So Africa, for a long time, was avoided by white settlement and white colonization by European powers because they got everything they needed from the coastal kingdoms who were shipping slaves out and that sort of way. And walking any further than the coast usually got you disease and you died. Right? It just like we didn't have those resistances developed. But as resistances got built up, and as Europeans got better medical techniques to be able to care for those things, they're like, wait a minute, there's this entire continent that is effectively unsettled, and we're all going to build empires right now. Tension started to rise. Otto von Bismarck is like, okay, I don't want a war over Africa. Everyone come to Berlin. Every European power that's interested, we're going to come to Berlin, we're going to discuss who gets what. Do you know how many African representatives there were? 0. Now, that's kind of an extreme example, and it's not an example where there would ever have been an African involved in the colonization process of their home continent. But it's still an interesting example in the context that diversity of opinion does have inherent value because it would allow you to prevent things like that from happening.
So there are definitely plenty of advantages to diversity. I'll not deny that because it's even rooted in our genetics. Like the reason humans as a species are, or a lot of species are so successful is because we rely on sexual reproduction. We have genetic diversity, which allows us to to kind of specialize in certain ways and to allow for a persistent avoidance of horrible mutations that can get passed down and stuff. Because the more diverse we are, the less likely it is for a bad mutation to carry down through lots of generations or something. Anyway, what I was going to get at was you're looking at things from a very macro scale, which in our society is just the way to look at it generally. But just to be a devil's advocate, because I think I'm agreeing with you the more we talk about it, but just to be devil's advocate, one thing that makes me think about this question about the inherent value of diversity so much is I imagine a tribe in Africa that's just untouched. Well, not completely untouched, but mostly untouched. Ignored by the rest of the world. I'll put it that way. I think a couple dozen people going about doing their own things, farming, got kids playing, throwing rocks and stones around, and people dancing every now and then. And they'll have you just have this very small group of people that are all extremely similar and like-minded. And of course, you could argue that there's even diversity in that small group, but you just have people who are just going about their own thing, living their lives, and they are, again, largely untouched by the other cultures and other people. And I think about because there are tribes like that all over
the world, really,
all over the world, yeah, and especially on islands and stuff. And I think about those people, and I'm there's the argument to be made that they don't have to deal with the same things we have to deal with because we just have drastically different lives and drastically different environments and societies and stuff. But at the same time, it's if there were inherent value in diversity, then you'd probably see these people being very miserable and whatnot. But oftentimes they're a lot happier than we are and a lot more content and fulfilled.
You do not know the opportunity that you cannot see. And humans remained in that tribal nomadic state for thousands and thousands of years. And it's actually a very easy argument to make that whenever big cities started to develop, that the average quality of life for most humans went down. For the upper crust, it went up, but for most humans it went down. So it's a good question. It's like, why is it that if these societies exist and still exist because they persisted over the course of thousands of years, 2,000 years of, I would say, like almost like kind of more like the modern times of human history, why is it that diversity is valuable if they exist and they are happy? And I think it's because that, first off, many of these societies that do still exist have major geographical barriers that prevent them from interacting with the world and prevent the world from interacting with them. Tribes in the Amazon, the islands like we talked about, those tribes in Africa exist deep in the savannah and stuff. So there's already that kind of barrier in the first place that's like I don't want to cross the fucking desert to go talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Right? And second, I think it's, if your argument is that on a micro scale, these societies have achieved the best possible human society and the best possible human experience, then maybe you're right. But if you can acquiesce even at one point that maybe, well, even in my outside bias perspective, maybe the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is not what the human existence could be, then suddenly you have to acknowledge that diversity of opinion allows us to achieve a better human existence.
So, yeah, and I'm not denying that whatsoever. Yeah.
Because that would be my point. It's like, if your point is that they are good societies and they're perfect societies, which once again is objective. There are people who are like anarcho-primitivists and want to go back to the hunter-gatherer way. Whatever.
Yeah, I mean, well, and a lot of this is just coming from Rousseau, and I am not a fan of Rousseau. So I don't agree with him that, like, oh, we should avoid art and science and culture in general and just go back to the primitive stone caveman days. We should definitely not do that. Because I think there's a lot of, like you said, like, you know, lots of opportunities come as we advance as a society, and we unlock new experiences, new means of interacting with one another. We solve problems that, you know, that these other societies are plagued with, like, you know, disease and stuff. We don't gotta worry about that nearly as much.
Yes.
If one of them stubs their toe in the wrong way or gets cut by a rock, they might die in 3 days.
So I think if you examine it on the most micro scale there is in a societal sense, and like examine an individual person, then I think you have the answer to your question. Does diversity have inherent value? Would you be happy with a life that was the same every day? No. Most people, especially in America, of course this is a culturally informed thing, want a diversity in life experience.
Well, and like you just said, like, it's kind of a cultural thing. You know, some people are very content just doing the same thing day in, day out.
It's also a person thing.
A person thing.
Right.
Well, and, like, again, I fully agree that there's value in diversity, but I'm trying to attack, like, inherent value.
Well, let's talk about Plato's Cave then. Diversity of idea, right? People who are happy in and doing the same thing every day might not know that there is a whole world above their cave.
Well,
right?
but do they need to know that to be happy? Well, no. And then also, and you were talking about, like, you know, you never know the opportunities you don't have. And, like, yeah, it's cool to have other opportunities, but also not necessary.
So I think the word inherency is like what they hinge upon your argument. It's like you're saying there is value. You agree there is value in diversity, but is inherent to the value of the human experience. My argument is yes, but I think that at this point it is a subjective question. It is not a, can we pinpoint what's it?
I know we're doing fine. 53 minutes.
So I actually have to be somewhere at noon. So
okay.
to wrap this up soon, I have to go get a haircut. But inherency is one of those things that is impossible to prove for most things, right? Inherent value in anything is really hard to prove. Inherent value in happiness is really hard to prove. So I am saying that the inherency of the value of diversity is implicit in the benefits that we have discussed.
Well, and I would say, yeah, you know, like just because, again, I love me some diversity. Like, you know, I love talking to people with different backgrounds because, well, first of all, it's fascinating, but also it accelerates your learning, and it gives you a more well-rounded perspective when you are tackling new ideas and stuff. Like, you know, like this conversation and stuff that we're both having, you know, you huge history buff, so you've got plenty of ideas that you can throw into this. And while I'm not nearly as well-versed as you are, didn't even know about the African scramble or the scramble for Africa.
Yeah, look up the Berlin Conference. It's interesting.
Berlin Conference. The only thing I recognize, you said Otto von Bismarck. I was like, Iron Chancellor.
Iron Chancellor, yeah. Well, I mean, it was a genius move. If your goal, and I know this is kind of a side tangent, we do have to end this soon, but his goal was to prevent war in Europe, and he succeeded. Because people would be willing to fight over the land in Africa, and he's like, let's just split it up, guys.
Split it up.
So if you're Eurocentric and you're like, oh, we prevented war in Europe, good job, guys. But if you want to understand the true consequences of that, look up the Belgian Congo.
The Belgian Congo.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Belgian Congo for a second. I just imagine like a whole nation of people just doing a conga line.
No, the Belgian Congo, I guess I'll discuss it in brief, is quite possibly one of the greatest consistent human tragedies that ever happened.
I'm surprised I've never heard of it then. Wow.
Well, classic denialism, downplayment, that sort of thing. But long story short is rubber in an industrializing society, very valuable. Wheels, belts for machines and stuff like that. And Belgian Congo is full of rubber. And Belgium was given the Congo as sort of like a diplomatic, let's keep everyone in peace, because everyone wanted that piece of land, so they gave it to little Belgium, because little Belgium, no one cares what little Belgium does, right? And like if I like the UK was like, I don't want France to have it, and France was like, I don't want the UK to have it, but Belgium can have it. Essentially is what it was. So it's almost like such a playground situation. And King Leopold II, to make sure that he could, because it was his personal domain. It wasn't the Belgium's. It was King Leopold of Belgium's personal colony, right? And he's like, you know what? I want to get really fucking rich and be one of the richest people in Europe. And he did that by placing harsh quotas on the natives to farm the rubber. And if you didn't farm the rubber fast enough, you had your hands chopped off.
I'm sorry. I just keep thinking, you keep saying farm the rubber, and it sounds like an innuendo for some reason.
I go. That's fair, actually. That kind of sounds like an innuendo.
Huh. I'm sorry, continue.
No, that's it.
Okay.
Look it up. Seriously.
Okay.
Watch a video on it or something. It's one of those things I think informs your perspective.
Well, and actually, now that I think about it, talking about inherent value and diversity and stuff, I think the Bible even speaks to an inherent value and diversity, especially diversity of thought, because one of my favorite verses in the book of Proverbs is like, hey, this is just a summary, obviously, but it's like, look, if you got to make a decision, get a lot of advisors. Many advisors make great decisions, right? But making a decision without being properly informed is kind of bad and stupid, right? And so there are even passages of the Bible that emphasize that. Well, and like Jesus, he was going around doing these miracles. Like he didn't discriminate, and anti-discrimination is in a way appreciating diversity. It's like, yeah, people are different. That's cool, not cringe. And that's what Jesus did. And everyone was like, "You're stupid. Why are you doing this? Like, why are you going to these blind people? Why are you going to these beggars? So why are you helping the tax collectors? What are you doing, man? You're stupid."
Oh, the tax collectors? Oh, you had me until the tax collector. I was joking.
well, see, that's just it. Like that was a big thing that surprised a lot of people about Jesus. Like, because yeah, of course he's helping the poor people, but why is he also helping the rich people? And it's like, well, because everyone needs help in some way, right? And I think diversity allows you to see how people need help and where they need it, and that's where like the conversation of equity comes in, just to wrap things up in a nice little bow. Like the way Dr. Bob described it was like, if I'm teaching a student, it's like, or teaching a class of students, one student's great at reading, horrible at writing, another's great at writing but can't focus on reading, can't focus on understanding others' ideas, even though they're great at explaining their own ideas. He's not going to teach the kid who's bad at writing how to read, and the kid who's bad at reading how to write. He's going to teach them and work with them on what they need to work on. That's what he did with all of our papers. It's like, Justin, you need to get better with your use of commas and your use of contractions and whatnot. And like, I'm going to make up a name. Lexi, you need to work on your use of commas and run-on sentences and stuff like that, right? Teachers work with you based on what you need to work on. They don't give you the same treatment. And I think that sort of local equity is very valuable. I think where a lot of conservatives start getting concerned is when you try to have a sort of federal equity. And, this makes sense because, conservatives definitely believe in, like, more power to the states and stuff like that. And I definitely see the value in that. And, that's why we have a system that works with a lot of different levels. But like you said, what makes America so kind of powerful, and what's helped us come to where we are today, is because we have the ability to divvy things out to people on different levels who have the capacity to work with that.
Yeah.
Based off their skills and their upbringing and their sometimes
it's
geographical
they're like,
position.
okay, we need to, like, if you're in the park service and you're managing your park, you're like, I need to chop down this tree. You don't have to call your manager, to call their manager, to call their manager. You just be like,
just call Mordecai and Rigby. They'll do it.
That's fine. That's real fine.
Man, I love Regular Show. I rewatched that. This a couple months ago. I've been binging a lot of shows on HBO Max, actually. Clone High. I'm so excited for season 2 of Clone High.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
It's coming 4 days, actually. It's going to be going up in 4 days. So that's awesome.
It's about to be on the internet again, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm about to start seeing clips on YouTube Shorts.
I'm kind of sad they got rid of Gandhi. I understand why, because they were getting like literal death threats.
Mm-hmm.
But Gandhi was a funny character.
He was. No chill, India. Come on. All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up because I gotta go cut my hair myself.
Should we try to end it like exactly an hour? That'd be pretty cool. That would be awesome.